Hi everyone, so today let's talk about the migration era. Now, this is a very beautiful part of history, in my opinion, not just because I wrote a thesis back in the day, my triennial degree about a topic occurring into this age, but also because relatively to the Middle Ages, and arguably not only obviously that, it was a bit the founding moment. I mean, the premises for medieval history are placed into this very dynamic scenario that takes place actually over a very long time overall. Um, and just yesterday, while talking about the migration era for another reason, I substantially um, periodized it between the 3rd and 6th century, but one could indeed extend it before and after, if anything, because migrations have always been out there. In history, humans have always been on the move, and generally when we talk about the migration era, we tend to imagine that moment of late antiquity, most of all. So even centering this period from a Roman perspective, usually, meaning that this huge historiographical chapter of how the barbarians meant as not in the contemporary meaning of the word that um, but rather to this generic group of very diverse telling truth that and that came into the Roman Empire is something that has really changed the world at the time, and obviously set premises for later. But today I would like to talk a little bit about the earlier times, the times in which the migrations were actually put in motion. What I wanted to say now is also that migrations have always been there in many times, even in the Indo-Europeans themselves. So those who eventually would make up the sedentary populations that, in a certain sense, suffered during the migration era had been nomadic peoples on their own. The European identity is actually a Caucasian identity, or an Indo-Aryan identity, as you want to call it, that spread from a proto-Indo-European civilization, which was a nomadic one. So we can argue that much of nomadism actually even remained in the ancient world once that the various peoples, the Greeks, the Italics, the Celts, had been sedentarized largely. And I also made a video that is the one about the origins of European cavalry that actually stresses the importance of the nomadic past of Europe in order to explain also where cavalry came from, not just from the migration era, but even from a previous substratus that eventually was fueled again during this period, which is crucial. Today, however, I would like to talk about the very beginning of the migration era, or at least to observe how the whole thing was put in motion, and trying a bit to redefine this age not as such, but as a kind of cyclical, or at least repeated phenomenon that occurred even in other times, and that instead, historiographically speaking, we have kind of emphasized because it brought to an end of the Roman and Chinese civilization, or at least to a transformation of the same, and that had in fact a common cause of these of the migration of the of part of the Eurasian nomadic populations. Now you can argue that the migration era was born from the Roman perspective, really quite early in time, even before the birth of Christ. It's it's substantially 2nd century BC, when from the Jutland Peninsula, today's Denmark, the Cimbri and Teutones Germanic peoples put themselves into march and started wandering along around Europe, in a fashion that, by the way, is incredible, because normally when we look at the map of the ancient world, we tend to see these quite sedentary groups of the Germans, of the Celts, that more or less lived in the same places, although they were nomadic or semi-nomadic in part. But the Cimbri and the Teutones, out of, of apparently of no verifiable reason, that however we think was the usual demographic problem, the inability of feeding people in the same place, started to go across Europe back and forth, really. You know, it's not that they started, you know, to move from Denmark at a point to arrive somewhere else. These were, even strategically speaking, very short terms, planifiable expeditions that had even a sort of checking function, in the sense that the important was to leave, because evidently they were forced to leave, because the local resources couldn't support the amount of population. This is the main reason. But where they had to settle eventually was unknown, and since geographical knowledge was indeed very scarce, there was a very different conception even of space and time. The best thing to do was to leave and to search, place after place, a good area to settle in. And that's why the Celts, the Cimbri and the Teutones literally came. Well, first of all, they descended Central Europe. They arrived into Noricum, roughly today's Austria, Inner Austria. Then they passed into northern Spain. Then they came back to the north of Gaul. Then they came down, and that's where the Romans destroyed them separately, respectively in Provence and in the Po Valley. And this was already at the time, it was a pretty isolated migration, at least of that kind, of those numbers. And the Celtic world, and even the Germanic world in part, during Roman times, showed that kind of mobility. Think, for instance, about the Boii or the Suebi that we will be seeing in a while. But the migration of the Cimbri and the Teutones was definitely something very big, and not just for the length of their journey, but also because they were quite a big and dangerous people overall. So this kind of migrations was set in motion, also and triggered a very special event in antique history, that is the Roman invasion of Gaul. Julius Caesar invaded central Gaul because essentially he wanted to defend that area and the local Gallic tribes from the migration of another Celtic people, that was the one of the Helvetii, that lived roughly in today's Switzerland, and that were also very fierce and warlike people, seemingly mixed, heavily mixed with the Germans, just like the Belgians, and that was threatening, as a matter of fact, to subdue great parts of Gaul. So Caesar basically took that chance to intervene militarily into Gaul, not just to defend obviously the Gauls from the Helvetii, but especially to subdue the world Gaul as we know. And the same problem, however, the same phenomenon occurred for same event. I mean, the Roman invasion of Gaul occurred for a broader threat that was actually stopped by Caesar at that point. It was much greater than the one of the Helvetii, who were wiped out relatively easily. That was the Germanic migration of the Swabian people into Gaul. Basically, the Germans at that point had been, historically speaking, in previous centuries, started descending towards Central Europe from Scandinavia. And once they occupied roughly today's Germany until the Main River, they started going west across the Rhine into Gaul. This was simply because Gaul was an extremely rich region, and the Germans saw fit to invade that area because the Gauls were quite rich, but also politically divided and not so much militarily. Used to fight, at least for the German standards. And this was a big threat because once the Germans would have settled into Gaul, they would have been a threat even for the Romans, because the Gallic resources could be eventually used against the Romans as well, not by the Gauls, who were weak and divided as we've seen, but by the Germans, who were still quite tempered at that time. And famously, Caesar defeated the Germanic chieftain Ariovistus, who was the sources call him like the king of the Swabians. Telling the truth, it was probably more heterogeneous group, surely maybe of Swabian dominance, but it wasn't really technically the whole Swabian confederation. And by defeating the Germans, Caesar even made certain an expedition across the Rhine with terroristic purpose to basically frighten the Germans and to avoid them thinking that they could come once again into Gaul, which in fact didn't happen from that time onwards. And that partially settled the Germanic question in those years. And telling the truth, as we know, during the Augustan age, it was the Romans who had been on the offensive and invading Germany, succeeding at a point. For 20 years. Germany up to the Elbe River was under Roman domination. Then after the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, the Romans lost Germany again, and the relation between the Romans and Germans was always quite complex and intense, because basically the Germans lived so close to the Romans and basically bordering them west and south from the German perspective, that they unavoidably came to be influenced by them in some measure, and they even got Romanized in part. So I will talk extensively about such topics in a better occasion. Also because there are many interesting military details that I would like to discuss, but I'm not making videos strictly about military history yet. And let's say that until the 3rd century, essentially the Germanic peoples remained relatively quiet on the borders. There were certain incursions that started happening from the Marcomannic Wars in the 2nd century AD, famously during the empire of Marcus Aurelius, who also fought a war against them. But let's say that at that point there were just certain Germanic incursions at a local level, and not really very big threats coming from Germany. It's during the crisis of the 3rd century that the things start to change. Because the Roman Empire was in crisis. So sometimes we are prone to think that, I know, it was the Germans who actually destroyed the empire, but it wasn't really like that. If anything, it was the Romans who destroyed themselves, and this triggered the Germans to take advantage of the situation. And large parts of these peoples actually kept even fought for the Romans. You have to think that up to that point and beyond, so from the Augustan age, the Romans had basically integrated successfully many Germanic tribes into their borders. There were Romano-Germanic citizens in the Roman Empire. So the relation with the Romans was also an opportunity for the Germans. Many auxiliaries used by the Romans came from Germany, we know that. And this kept happening even during the late antique time on a regular basis. So we don't have to force any dichotomy like, the Germans were against the Romans and vice versa. They had overall as blocks different interests, but sometimes they would overlap. And the things really in the Germanic world had remained steady and stationary practically until, as we've seen, the second half of the 2nd century AD. From that point, and we don't know exactly why, there is a sort of system that that puts in motion the Germanic tribes, and that also creates instability within the empire. Think, by the way, that this is the period of the Antonine Plague. Society is being transformed in Europe in many ways. The old setting that Augustus had given to the Roman Empire was starting to show some weakness, although it was still functional. And one thing, however, that we have to say is that at this point, the Germans were still largely divided into tribes, not really into confederations. We named the Swabians before because the Swabians were the greater confederation existing in Germany since a very early age, from the 1st century BC, as far as we know, if not before. But that's the moment, at least, in which they come into direct contact with the Romans, who has studied the late Roman Empire knows that it's much easier to control a confederacy than various tribes, than the tribes who singularly make it up, for the simple reason that you can interact with a single interlocutor, essentially. So even Roman politics was usually aimed to and not just with the Germans, to give a sort of, to recognize a sort of head of certain within certain peoples, or on a regional scale, so that they could keep things under control without getting thoroughly into interact into the mess of tribes that made these people up. And And however, from the 3rd century, if not before, we start seeing that the Germanic peoples start essentially to push one against the other. There is sort of synetic push, that synetic force that starts fueling these movements. And because of the Germanic fragmentation, these movements would be quite difficultly predictable. And from a strategical point of view, predictability means really a lot, because the Romans already had difficulties to plan effective strategies. We don't have to discuss this, but meaning that the Romans really didn't have such a strong centralized strategical policy like we would be used to think. There was much decentralization along the provinces, and the world situation obviously created more problems if you don't know what these peoples are going to do in a short while, especially if they are so many and so divided. And let's say, regarding the migration era, I would like to to address also another topic that might arise some perplexity maybe to those who were still not familiar with it, but historiographically speaking, it's been a thing now for quite some time. That is the idea that there wasn't nothing like really like a Germanic like a Germanic people. Certain authors started to basically question the awareness of a shared identity of the people, of the Germanic people who largely made the migration era, by explaining that basically the idea of the Germans, like the idea of the Celts, was substantially an ethnographical invention of the Greeks and the Romans, who are the only historians at this time in the West, and who had conventionally called these very large groups of peoples in that way by differentiating them in a certain fashion to better understand what they were talking about. But from the Germanic or Celtic perspective, things were much more complicated. I generally I'm a bit of a conservative under this point of view, in the sense that I do identify a certain difference between the Celts, the Germans, and other European peoples. But what is important here is that not much what was the actual difference, because it's obvious that in certain ways Celts and Germans differed, and the same Celts differed from the various areas of Eurasia where they settled. But the problem here is to conceive whether they perceived themselves as such, and from their perspective, telling the truth, what was really more meaningful was the tribe. The idea that they belonged to a stock that probably shared a lot with other populations, but that really didn't have so as a center of gravity the idea of a common Germanic identity, like in the Germans' case. And during the migration era, where the process of Romanization of these peoples was actually pretty much accelerated and fastened, the same Germans basically adopted the Roman preconception that was present in Mediterranean towards them, and eventually strengthened their own Germanic identity on the base of this, rather than the contrary. This is very important, if anything, for one reason during the migration era. That is the basic impossibility to define ethnically speaking the identity of these peoples from an objective point of view. The migration era was characterized essentially by the great mobility and fluidity of the groups that put themselves in motion during this period. Something that was in fact fueled by the same mobility, and especially by one thing that is what starts happening from the 3rd century AD, that is the passage from tribal identity in many ways to confederative identity. What does this mean? It means that basically the Roman Empire was more or less stable in spite of civil wars, etc. The empire for several centuries, at least remained a unitary entity. From a political point of view, beyond the Roman frontier, the situation was much more dramatic, was much more messy. First of all, there were much less resources, so if any sudden change occurred in the balance, in the economical and demographical balance, and this really happened quite frequently at the time, there was someone who was risking really much in that environment. So one way to avoid annihilation from other groups that could kick you out or or exterminate you was to form greater entities that in fact were the confederacies. When we talk about peoples like the Franks, the Alemanni, the Goths, we don't have to think about actual tribes that made it eventually, with that name from certain origin. Those were names that were created during the migration era. That is, before they didn't exist. In fact, most of these names are very very eloquent about this. The Franks means the free. Alemanni means old men. So there were generic names that were given to groups of tribes whose names are known. Much of the Franks, for instance, were those tribes inhabiting Western Germany that had fought against the Romans during the Roman invasion of Germany. So we can keep track of that. But these were new groups who in fact had a confederative asset, which was emphasized, you see, even from the same names, the idea that they got together but they were still free. They will still put all on the same level, because the Germans were quite jealous of their own independence. So even when they got together and they maybe elected a common chief to lead them into during their migrations, they were quite cautious at premising that they were still, however, all equal. They had all the same contractual power. Then obviously in practical terms it wasn't the case, because the migration era was also a moment in which it was a ferocious subjugation of the weaker in this process, and in certain cases a high degree of stratification for German standards was formed. This happened very heterogeneously depending on the people we're talking about. For instance, the Goths were quite developed a much more hierarchical society than, say, the Longobards. This happened for many reasons, but the important is to understand that when these guys put themselves on the move from the 3rd century onwards, they kind of change identity for exactly for migrating, and for migrating into a very hostile environment they required a different organization from the one they had in the past. And this implied by the way, that they necessarily had to be opened at including new peoples within their ranks. And I was stressing the impossibility of any precise ethnical definition at this time, because these weren't just Germans, or what we believed, what the Romans called as Germans. But there was an infinity of people. We're talking about Germans, about Celts, about Illyrians, about Sarmatians. We will be saying this about Turkish elements coming from the depth of the Eurasian of Central Asia. We're talking about even Romanized populations that at a certain point get overrun by these guys, and they join the same Germanic confederacies and become part of them. So an extremely multi-ethnical setting, asset that however gravitated around the idea that it was needed to be united in that moment, because being divided could equate to annihilation, or to the integration inside another people who would impose its own identity, its own culture on you. And this happened many times, because generally the most successful Germanic confederacies, the ones that eventually made it to create the Romano-Germanic kingdoms that started the early medieval world, had largely survived because they had been the ones who had defeated other competitors and had included them to strengthen their numbers. Also because you have to think that demographic dynamics here were quite important. These groups weren't really so enormous numerically speaking. Even a battle or a war could seriously drain their demographic resources. And since we're talking about warriors that have to fight on a battlefield, obviously the more you were, the more theoretically you had chances to win, even though economical matters are important as well, because there were also very numerous peoples who, however, were quite poor, or maybe whose aristocracies had deprived of many strength and power, that effectively on the battlefield were quite weak and would be subdued by maybe less numerous groups that, however, had a much stronger national cohesion and military efficiency than them. And by the way, we usually, even in the map that I prepared today, we see generally the Roman perspective of the migration era. But telling the truth, the Germans really didn't migrate just directly into the empire. In these centuries, groups of Germans from Central Europe basically started expanding to Eastern Europe, towards the Ukraine and the Black Sea. And it's famously the case of peoples like the Burgundians, the Vandals, and especially the Goths. They're usually named as the Eastern Germans to differentiate them from the one of the Elbe, from the Western Germans, or even the Southern Germans at a point. And these were incidentally the peoples who became more nomadic in culture. I mean, the easternmost you went from Germany, the more you tended to absorb a steppes lifestyle, because the Germans normally weren't much of a horse they weren't much of a horse riding people when they were in Germany, especially in Western Germany, that it's a very thickly forested area that is very poor for cavalry. In fact, peoples like the Franks and the Alemanni seemingly didn't have a very strong cavalry, or at least not large in numbers, because the same environment made that unfit. However, we should never stress that so much, because they also had cavalry, of course. And however, the definitely the most important groups of the Eastern Germans were the Goths. They would play, in fact, a very important role within the same borders of the Roman Empire, because they came to be settled by the Romans, especially after Battle of Adrianople, into the Roman borders themselves. This means that the Goths were also there's a bit of a paradox in here, because the Goths were probably some of the least German peoples that existed during the migration era among the Germanic group, simply because they had gone into so far into the east that they had included peoples that had nothing to do with the Germans in large numbers. But at the same time, they were the most Romanized Germanic groups of the migration era, and the one, in fact, that kept into their kingdoms the greater Roman influence in their politics and administration. Visigothic Spain and Ostrogothic Italy definitely were strikingly close to Roman states than many other Germans. And this is quite important, because it tells you, also very much about the process of acculturation, and by how multi-ethnical had become the same Roman society during the migration era. So it was a very transversal change, and in fact we should never see the Roman frontier as a hard, solid frontier. It had always been permeable, it had always been passed, there had always been a great number of exchanges. And the reasons why the Germans eventually came to enter into the Roman borders, it wasn't much of a reason of conquering the Roman Empire, but basically the idea of being harbored in what would be the point of reference of the late antique world. And since these peoples were quite aware of that, since they had inhabited the Rhine and Danube frontier for centuries, and they knew very well the Romans in many ways already. And they absolutely didn't want to destroy the Roman civilization, but on the contrary, according to their cultural possibilities, they tried as much as they could to keep that system alive, and trying obviously at the same time to rule it in the Roman place. So the story of the Goths is very fascinating, because these were peoples that had settled initially around the Vistula River. This was an area that we don't know very much, even both historically and historiographically and archaeologically speaking, because it was very far from the Roman world at that point. This is the same area in which the Vandals were settled. The Vandals seemingly were quite mixed, probably not even a Germanic people proper, but that seemingly they had at least very strong Slavic elements within them. And what is important, however, as I was saying before, is that this was an area pretty close to the steppes, and the Goths cross the Vistula and go towards the Black Sea, reaching the Don steppes, so proceeding southeast essentially from northern Europe, and settling there. This is the point when the Goths practically meet the the nomadic peoples of the steppes proper, especially the Sarmatians. They were linguistically speaking belonging to an Iranian, the Iranic branch of the Indo-European peoples that has nothing to do with Iran, but simply was essentially the nomadic branch of the Indo-Europeans that remained in the steppes. They're called the Iranian branch because parts of them eventually settled into Iran, but much earlier than this time, and gave birth, in fact, to the Persian civilization or identity, at least that is Indo-European indeed. But there were, blonde, blue-eyed. There were horse riding warriors mostly, and horse archers. That had been pretty much known even to the Mediterranean peoples since the early antiquity in many ways, because the Sarmatians had made a lot of incursions along the Black Sea coasts, where that were populated by Greek colonies in the ancient world, and they often had imposed to these tributes and other forms of impositions, and that eventually had been a bit more redimensioned in their ambitions when the Hellenistic kingdoms, and especially the Roman Empire, had expanded. However, they were the Sarmatians were a bit, for the Greeks and the Romans, they were a bit the prototype of the barbarian. In all its exotic stereotype in many ways. They fought on horseback. They had strange practices. There were even women among the warriors. So they were, from the Mediterranean perspective, kind of the world in reverse, kind of bizarre, the prototype of a bizarre society in the classical imaginary, and in this sense, the Germanic elements that traveled east came to mix always more. Almost more frequently with the nomadic populations, and in this and this brought obviously to a great transformation of their own culture. So the Germans of the forests that normally fought on foot and had a very maybe a relatively sedentary society became, into the eastern steppes, substantially horse-riding peoples with a very different culture and identity from the one that they had previously. Then, obviously, on the western side of Germany, so in that world that was bordering with the Celtic and Roman world on the Rhine and on the high Danube, there was also a strong pressure. We mentioned the Alemanni, for instance, that were quite fierce opponents of the Romans. The Alemanni were also very strongly Romanized, militarily speaking. They had copied the Roman equipment in some measure. They were a quite dangerous enemy who could access the Alpine border and creating problems to Rome. And from the east, however, arrived other peoples that are the Alans. The Alans, telling the truth, were Sarmatians, and if I'm not wrong, they were the easternmost Sarmatian tribe, regionally speaking, and they were the one from whose geographical location had got more influenced by the heavy cavalries of the steppes. So they were quite fierce and effective, militarily speaking, and they would be a very a force to be reckoned with. And were also seemingly known in Chinese sources, and that tells you how much these people were capable of moving fast across the Eurasian steppes, and how, feared that they were by the sedentaries, because these were normally remembered as, very warlike, dangerous peoples who could knock at your gates from a moment to another. And what happened is that the Alans became to push west, and this brought sort of domino effect, for which the rest of the Sarmatians moved west and were even more integrated into the Germanic peoples that had instead coming into their direction from the west. And in fact, the Sarmatians came to be some of the most important demographic and military auxiliaries of the Goths. They were basically included and absorbed in large numbers by the Gothic people. There was also a lot of infighting between these groups, especially along the areas, in fact here along the lower Danube, that had always been a quite unstable frontier in many ways, and that at that point came to be the harbor of many peoples who were pushed, as a matter of fact, from the east, including the Goths at a certain point, but I would like to stop before now. This for saying, this is what I really want to emphasize, how the Germans were actually influenced by the how they turned, basically, thanks to the Sarmatian influence, into a nomadic people themselves, also in strategical terms, meaning that they began to behave like a nomadic people also for the rights against the empire. So being equipped with very good cavalry, which was eventually very much prized also by the Huns when they arrived. Now we stopped before because I want to tell that chapter in another moment, but the Huns at a certain point are able to subjugate the Ostrogoths, and the Ostrogoths were extremely prized as horsemen by the Huns. We weren't really the last cavalrymen around, so that tells you how the Goths especially had absorbed, how deeply they had absorbed Eastern influences. And coming a little back on, and I finish then, about the Gothic identity, we have to say that probably it was pretty much made up, in the sense that peoples like the Longobards, for instance, had a much more traceable history in many ways, in the sense that in spite of the fact that they lived in Central Europe and we don't know much about them, we at least know what kind of ethnogenesis they had. The Goths instead are very mysterious people before they before they entered directly in contact with the Romans, for which we start to have a concrete historical documentation of their of who they were and what they did. And the idea that the Goths were born essentially out of Germany is also debated, meaning that normally people say, well, but the Goths were, they take the name from the Swedish island of Gotland, You see that the name is the same, Gotland, land of the gods, and they call themselves gods. So yeah, they came from Gotland. Well, no, it doesn't seem to be true in the case of the gods. Meaning what? But it's complicated to explain. I might need another video to explain that. But in short, let's start to make it short. Basically, the Goths. Remember when I said that they were the most Romanized peoples, Germanic peoples who came to be from the migration era? Well, the point is that the Romans had a great prejudice, of stereotype, as you wanna. That basically all these Germanic peoples came from a terrible place in north of Europe that was usually identified with Scandinavia. Now it is true that the Germans came from Scandinavia originally speaking, or at least the Baltic Sea, so this area of northern Europe that can coincide with Sweden and Gotland, etc. But it had become such, first of all, it had been chosen and supported as a concept because Scandinavia was like the most primitive land of all from the Roman point of view. So it was such an impossible place to live, from which such a fierce people like the Germans, only such a fierce and ferocious people like the Germans could come from their perspective. So this cliché of the of Scandinavia, like the vagina of peoples, essentially, this kind of land that regurgitated with all these various populations that eventually spread all over the continent, was a pretty much out there at the time, and from the Gothic perspective, it was a sort of prestige to stress their origin from those places. So, telling the truth, it seems that the gods made up their own identity by calling themselves gods, in fact, to stress that origin. But as a matter of fact, about their ethnogenesis, we don't have even any evidence that there was a Germanic core at the beginning. It seems that it was something extremely much more complex, extremely much more variegated, and this is also expressed by their, this is evident at least, by their myth of the origins. These peoples, when they were Romanized and they started writing down their story, or they let the Romans writing it down for them, basically made up, their tried to stress the memory of their pasts and their legends, etc. And while for certain peoples we have, very fantasy stories telling the truth about their origins, but at least we can see some, some sparkle of truth into it, or certain hints that can let us track their story through that document. The gods, in their mythical origin, wrote such an amount of bullshit. Let's be frank about it. They really literally filled the story with so many cliches that didn't even belong to the Germanic culture, but they were myths of Greek and Roman classical historiography. So really what the picture that we get from the gods is that probably they were formed by such an extremely heterogeneous group of peoples that we can't even guess or reasonably need to say they came from here. So don't let yourself be tricked by the name, because we have much more, probably of all the Germanic peoples, the Goths are the one who have the most mysterious and darker origin, about which we really can't know anything concrete, historically speaking. Yet they were a people that really made history because they were the ones who in fact created the Visigothic Visigothic Kingdom of Spain, the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Italy. They managed to defeat the Romans at the Battle of Adrianople, and that's why they were integrated so early into the empire. So they were very, very important, and they carried with themselves an identity that probably even influenced the same structure of those kingdoms, even though, as we have seen, they were also very intensely Romanized. But for saying that a people like the Goths had very few in common with the Franks, the Alemanni, and other peoples whose origins can be traced, and they don't seem to have anything to share with the Goths. At the same time, it must be recognized also another thing, that when the Goths settled into southern Europe, essentially, they were recognized as Germans also by the other Germanic peoples, like the Franks, for instance, or the Langobards had quite of they recognized the Germanity of the Goths in some way, but it was a matter of prestige, essentially, that the Goths had earned. I mean, from a Frankish perspective, it meant that if the Goths had managed to conquer Spain or Italy, they had to be great warriors, and it was a compliment they made to themselves to call them Germans, because the Germans absolutely didn't have any inferiority complex towards the Romans. On the contrary, so they were quite proud of having both fought for the Romans and against the Romans, because especially during the early medieval Europe, when they basically came to rule over the former lands of the Western Roman Empire, they very much felt the fact that they had achieved that as Germans, and that the empire essentially was transferred into their hands because they were more praiseworthy, more worthy than the Romans. This is something that lives very far even into the Holy Roman Empire idea. You know, the idea that that God at this point they were all Christians, had basically taken the empire from the Romans to entrust it to the Germans, who were more worthy of that. It all began here. So I talked for a very long time, haven't I? Well, yeah, almost an hour. I'm gonna stop here, but there is, telling the truth, so much to say about this chapter, because it's very fascinating. It's fascinating especially in ethnographical and ethnological perspective. You know, it's all a matter of perception, of it's a sort of a farce in a way. You know, it's a sort of it doesn't matter what the substance were. What really mattered, what was the name worth. And this is how I believe the migration era has to be read, because it was so mixed, really, in many ways, that probably stressing such singular identities was a way to create a new order from an otherwise messy and chaotic situation like the one of the migration era and the fall of the Western Roman Empire had produced. I thank you for listening. As always, if you liked my video, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe if you want to receive further contents. As always, I thank you for watching. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.